Watercolor Leaves. In this video I'm going to share 10 of my favourite techniques for leaf painting in watercolours. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Michelle, and on this channel you'll find all things watercolour, a little bit of mixed media and some business tips for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. If you click the bell notification, you get notified every time I have a video for you. I make one free video a week here on YouTube with extra content on Saturdays for my Patreon subscribers. Now, every leaf and every plant you come across as an artist will be different to you, and there's no one correct way of painting a leaf or a set of leaves in watercolour. However, I've got some tips for you today which I would say are some of my favourite techniques, and they aren't just to be used for leaves. You can use these for anything, including a lot of other botanical subjects, but I'm going to go through them one at a time. I'm going to point the camera downwards and show you how each one is done. I think you're going to find them really useful, but before we do that I'm going to give you a bonus tip. Now, bonus tips normally come at the end of videos, and they're kind of an incentive to keep you watching until the end. You've got 10 tips and then you've got a bonus tip. But the thing with this tip is it's going to inform how you see these techniques and how you paint all of them. So I want to give you the bonus tip at the beginning of the video. So my bonus tip for you today is a really simple one, but it's something that I see beginners getting wrong time and time again, and that's just to use a brush that's big enough. So I've got a couple of brushes here. Now, I do have bigger brushes than these, which I use sometimes for painting very big landscapes and skies. And I also have smaller brushes than these that I sometimes very rarely use for things like if I was painting an animal and I had to put a little dot in the eye, maybe a bird, something like that, I would go smaller than this. But I would say that 90% of my painting is done with brushes like these. So this is a size 10, this is a size 6. I very, very rarely go smaller than a size 6. I would really have to hunt around. I think I've got one really tiny brush. I would really have to, hunt around my studio to find a brush that's smaller than this, and I would be very, very dubious about using it. I would only use it, as I said, for a very small detail, a dot in an eye, some eyelashes, something like that. Perhaps the tiny veins on a leaf, perhaps that might be a time when I would use that very small brush, but I certainly wouldn't go smaller than this for painting a leaf, the main body of the part of the leaf. And the reason for that is that when you go to a small brush, you lose so much. You lose this ability to hold a lot of paint on that brush. And as you apply the paint, it's not going to spread very far, and it's not going to apply in a way that's very wet. So what this means is that not only will you run out of paint multiple times when getting across an area, also the paint will apply drier. It's going to dry quicker. What this means is drying lines, drying lines, drying lines everywhere. So if you find yourself, when you're painting petals and leaves and things like that, if you find that you're getting loads and loads of tiny drying lines, it could be as simple as just using a bigger brush. So the rule with brushes is use the biggest one you possibly can. This doesn't mean that you're not allowed to use a smaller brush, that you can't go down to that smaller brush, but you should only go down to the smaller brush when you absolutely have no choice. And to be honest, brushes like this, you can get really, really fine lines with these. Even, these are fairly old brushes, the point has gone a little bit, but I can still get a really, really fine, delicate line. And because that's how the brush was designed. It was designed to paint a large area, but also to paint fine detail. So my tip for you, my bonus tip when you're trying all of these techniques I'm going to go through, is to use as large a brush as possible. So let's get on with our 10 leaf painting techniques, and the first one of these is to use two colours on the same leaf and to blend them together using a wet into wet technique. So just to mention at this point, you may hear a few background noises. It's just been raining heavily, and you can hear some dripping on the roof of the studio. The sequence you watch the video in isn't necessarily the sequence that it's filmed in, because obviously I film certain sections in batches and then edit it later on. Now I'm going to paint this first leaf with two different colours in one, so that one colour just slides into the next colour. Now I'm going to be using Jackman's art materials for this entire video. So all of these paints will be by Jackman's, who are a British company that I have started working with. And here are some of their paints. So I'm going to use some cadmium yellow deep for this one. And I think we'll use, it says chrome ox, that means chromium oxide green. And this is a very natural green. So chromium oxides are always really, really natural colours. So I'm going to use, because it's a small leaf, I'm going to use my smaller brush. That's my size 6. Just going to take this little bit of paint out of the lid of this one actually. So I've just drawn generic leaf shapes today, so there won't be specific leaves in this particular video. So I'm going to start here. So you can see chromium oxide is kind of a dark, dull green. And to give this leaf a bit of interest, we're going to sort of transition straight into yellow without the paint drying. In fact, I'm going to change to my bigger brush because I'm already feeling that one's a bit small for what I'm doing here. Put a bit more water on that so that it's not too dark. And you can see I'm keeping this leading edge wet here. I've also got a piece of tissue paper. In case I get too much water on here, I can just dab some out onto there. And then I'm going to go straight in with the cadmium yellow. So you can see that I'm just letting one colour lead straight into the next without any drying lines. There are very seldom hard edges within leaves and within petals, so I tend to avoid them where I can. So I'm using fairly watery paint here, but if I want to go a little darker, I can just use my brush a little bit drier, pick up more paint, and then we can get a bit more colour going in there. I don't want to work on it too long because it'll start to dry and then I'll end up with drying lines. But you can put multiple colours in on the same leaf. You could put some blue in just to go darker, but here I've kept it really simple. So I've got chromium oxide green and cadmium yellow deep. Next we're going to look at painting veins on your leaves. So there are several different methods of doing this, and you have to consider first of all, you have to ask yourself, do you want the veins to be lighter than the leaf itself or darker than the leaf itself? Now there are, there are leaves where you get both going on within the same leaf, and this might be an approach if you were doing a spotlight painting. In other words, if your entire subject was one beautiful autumn leaf, then you could go into more detail and get those veins both light and dark within the same leaf. But really for a larger painting that's a garden painting or perhaps a floral painting, you really want to keep it simple. So have a look at your leaves and decide, do you want these leaves to be lighter, the veins to be lighter or darker than the leaf itself? The first technique, there are variations on this first technique, but the first technique I'm going to show you is my favourite way of painting light veins on a dark leaf. And what it's going to do is it's going to stop you getting all those annoying white gaps. So what I've done with this one is I've put a wash of cadmium lemon on it, and I've allowed it to dry. So what I want to do now is put the green almost around the pale yellow veins. Now I have got some pencil on here. Most of that would lift out later on, and I have to put more on because I'm filming so that you can see, but I would keep that fairly light. Most of it will lift out even after the paint has dried with an eraser. However, there are multiple ways of doing this technique. I could also have put masking fluid on here, and I could also have used candle wax, which I might show you in another video, but I'm actually just going to keep it simple. I'm just going to paint round. Now I prefer to do this wherever possible because I do find that masking fluid can look very, very unnatural when it comes to leaves. Now I'm going to paint right up to the edge of that pencil, and that's so that if any of it stays on later on, then it won't be showing too much. It'll be sort of partially covered up. So I'm going to go around here, and I can use that line that I've painted to indicate where to carry on. And I'm simply going to keep painting around. Now you may make some mistakes, you may go over a little bit that you didn't mean to go over, but as long as some of it is left showing, it's going to be absolutely fine. And I just find that it really does give a more natural look than masking fluid. If you're going to use masking fluid, really be very, very intentional and very careful. And you'll see that I'm working around the leaf methodically. I'm going one side to the other, and I'm keeping that leading edge wet. I don't have to worry about what's going on back here. I'm just keeping the bit that I'm using wet. Now this is Jackman's Emerald Green. It's a very bright blue based green. And I'm just going to keep going around. Now can you see I've got danger here of having a bit of a drying line there. It's rather, although it's been raining, it's rather warm in the studio. And so I'm just going to even out the water levels a little bit around there, just so that hopefully we won't get that drying line. Drying lines are caused by uneven water levels, so if you ever get the impression that they're about to start happening, although you don't want to go back on semi-wet areas with wet paint, that's not at all helpful. You do want to just try it if you can and even out the water levels. So I'm continuing to come around here. You can also hear a very noisy pigeon outside at the moment. I do love the pigeons, but they're rather fame hungry and they always want to be in my videos. So here we are, you can see I've got round most of this leaf now, and there's our dark leaf with light veins. Now my next technique is useful when you have very, very fine lines, very fine dark lines on a pale leaf. It's really easy to do and it gives such a beautiful natural effect, so that's what we're going to look at next. Now for this next leaf, I'm going to get dark veins on a lighter leaf. Now I'm only going to use one colour, so how am I going to achieve this? I'm going to do it by scoring. So what I'm going to do is get a knife like this and score the paper. Now you have to be careful with this. You don't want to hold it up like this, obviously, otherwise it's going to cut. Sometimes the angles can be deceptive on YouTube, particularly because I have the board at an angle for filming. But what I'm doing is I'm keeping the blade quite flat and scoring across so that I'm almost using the side of the blade and I am not raising the blade at a high angle. And I'm just going to score across here. Now I probably would do this without previously drawing. I'm just doing it so that you can see on YouTube what's going on. You can actually do this when the paint is wet and it will still work. It's also a technique that can be a little hit and miss. In other words, you can do it and find it doesn't show that much, but sometimes you just need to put another layer of paint on so that more of it sits in the dips. So what will happen is when the watercolour goes on, it will tend to sit and congregate in the little scratch lines, the little dips that I've made. This is a really good technique when you've got very, very fine lines. Now for this one, I'm going to use Viridian Green. As I said, it can be hit and miss, so we'll see how it comes out. It may be that I need to layer another colour on top or some more blue. It depends on the size of the little pigments as well, how well they sit into those dips. So I'm just going to start painting. And we should find that it sits in the dips. Of course, you can already see the dips because of the pencil. But you'll see there are some areas up here where I've gone beyond where the pencil is. So you should be able to see the paint starting to sit in those areas. As I said, occasionally it takes more than one layer of paint or perhaps a different colour of paint to get it working properly. It's a technique I also use for tree bark, which you may have seen in my other video. I will list that one above actually if you're interested in how to paint tree bark, because that uses this technique as well. So I hope you can see there, you're just starting to get those very, very fine sort of hair width lines. Now just to prove that it can be done while the paint is wet and just to show you how it looks when there's no pencil there, I'll take another couple of lines out here and you can see the paint just being attracted to those areas and sitting in. It's a little more risky going on to wet paint. You have to be careful because the paper is more fragile, but it does work very effectively. Let's go over a few of these here. I'm going to, just for the fun of it, to see if it adds a little bit more, I'm going to just take a layer of ultramarine blue on top of that, even though it's not quite dry yet. Now ultramarine is a granulating colour, so you would imagine that what will happen here is there'll be more larger pigments to be attracted to those areas, and you can see now it really starting to come into its own. You should never work, by the way, on part of a leaf like this if it's damp. If you are going to work into it and it's damp, take it across the whole area because you need to avoid that uneven drying. Now red and green are colour opposites. If you mix red paint with green paint, you can end up with brown. I'm going to show you a method now of getting these brightly coloured red veins on your green leaf without that happening. So for this next one, I want something a bit more autumny, so I've actually mixed my own green. So I've used phthalo blue and some yellow ochre. Again, they're both Jackman's paints. If you would like a discount off of Jackman's paints, you can pop into the video description, and I've got my my own 10% discount code there, which you can use. And they ship worldwide, and they do watercolours and paintbrushes and acrylics at the moment. And they're a small company, but they're growing all the time. So I'm going in with my colour here, and in order to get these veins, I want them to be bright this time. I want them to be red veins, and if I were to use paint, it might look a little bit uncomfortable. It might also layer with the green too much and just go sort of brownish, and I want to keep that strong red pigment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use watercolor pencil, and I'm going to go in while the paint is still wet, because that way the watercolor pigment will release more of its color. And I'm just going to take it in like this, and look how effective this is. Always with these veins I'm working center out, and that's so that as the pencil is lifted off the paper, it will come to a little bit of a taper and a point. If I were to go outside in, they'd end up looking very very stubby. So there's a really simple way of getting brightly coloured veins. One thing that I think can be a real shame when I see people painting leaves is if they clean them up too much, because leaves aren't always perfect and they do have things like, you know, they have spores on them, they have insect damage. I'm going to show you a method now of painting a hole in a leaf that looks really realistic. To me, that's what makes leaves special, not just making them into, you know, the perfect supermodel leaf, shall we say. So next I've drawn a leaf that's a little bit more battered and bruised, and it's got a hole in the middle. And the mix I'm using now, there's a lovely bright green they've got called spring green, but I want this one to be a little bit more autumn and faded, so I've put lots of yellow ochre and water into it. I've also got a sepia watercolour pencil that's been sharpened to a very strong point. This is Derwent watercolour pencil, and I'll put a link to everything I'm using down below in the video description. So again, I'm going to go in with very wet paint, and the idea is to get the colour on quickly. So this is what I was saying at the beginning about using as big a brush as possible, and it is a very strong mistake that lots of beginners make, is using a brush that's too small. I've actually got a video I made about lots of different mistakes that you can make as a beginner and sorts of brushes you might find yourself using that probably aren't very suitable for what you're doing. I will link to that one in the information cards up above. You can click on that without going off of this video if you want to watch that one later on. So it's made a really lovely natural green here, hasn't it? So I'm being very careful. You see I'm working on dry paper, so I keep that nice crisp edge to that hole there. Just for fun, since we've already done it once, we'll make a bit of a centre line here so that we don't lose that pencil. Just going to lift out some of that excess paint there as well, because that will cause me problems otherwise. Now whilst this is still wet, I've got my sepia pencil here. What I'm going to do is just go in and, you know, just outline just the very edges of this hole in places. You don't necessarily want to go all the way around because it can just look very fake. So you might just do it in one or two places like that, and then maybe just on the edge here. You can put as much or as little of it on as you like, and you can see you could use other colours as well. You don't have to stick to one colour, but look at that, a really effective natural looking hole that a caterpillar has eaten in my leaf. At this point, if you're finding this video in any way helpful, could I ask you for a quick favour? Could you please click the like button? YouTube rewards channels such as this with audience interaction, so if you click like, share, subscribe or leave me a comment, YouTube will help my channel to grow and push this video out to more people. So for my next tip, I'm going to show you a second way of getting a brightly coloured centre line down your leaf. But unlike the one that we did with the watercolour pencil, which is a great technique, that one's a little bit soft. This one is for when you need a much crisper edge, and I think you're going to really enjoy it. And I find when I do these tips videos, it's the wax resist techniques that people get really excited about, because to be honest, it's an underutilised way of using watercolours. So that's what we're going to do next. I think you'll like it. So for this next leaf, I'm going to use an oil pastel, and some of you have picked me up in previous videos for occasionally dropping the word wax in and saying, well, it's oil pastel, it's not wax crayon, which is very true. It's just that the technique tends to be referred to generally as wax resistant, so I sometimes accidentally drop the word wax in when I mean oil pastel, but it's definitely an oil pastel. This is a Talens Van Gogh oil pastel, which is their students range, but if you're looking for oil pastels for resist techniques in watercolour, perfectly good enough. So what I've got here is some tape. Now this is masking tape. Off camera I'll just stick it to my clothes a few times because I don't want it to be too sticky, it can tear the paper. You can also of course use some kind of low tack fair, washi tape may do the trick, or scotch tape may also work, and I'm applying it along the centre of this leaf, but I'm also, you can see, almost bending the tape. Now the tape won't bend, but you can kind of almost fold it, and so I'm just going along here. If you're ever at all uncertain about whether something may tear your paper or may not work, or a technique doesn't look any good, for goodness sake, try it out first on a scrap of paper. You never want to be sticking stuff on your paper, you know, on a painting that really means a lot to you, and just hoping that it works. So you have to try these out yourself as well, because I can't tell every single circumstance that's going to be in your life with your materials and your atmospherics, shall we say. So I'm going to apply this oil pastel, and what I'm doing is I'm pushing it into the gaps. Now if I just apply it lightly, it won't go right the way in, so I'm going to really sort of ram it down, and they're quite soft, so if you push and push and push, you'll be able to get quite a solid line forming there. And then once you feel like you've got that sorted out, very gently pull the tape off. Now the way to remove tape without tearing your paper, or at least a way that's better for not tearing your paper, is to move it slowly at a low angle, like so. Now oil pastel will come up a little bit on your brush when you paint, and it's not great for brushes, so I've actually changed to an older brush, and I suggest that you do the same. Whenever you're using oil pastel, you want to use an old brush. Now I've got a little bit in the wrong place there, so I'm just going to tidy and neaten that up just by replacing the tape a little bit. I've got a little bit that's gone off to one side as well, but I'm not too worried about perfection. So I'm going to use spring green now, which is a very bright green again, but it's not quite as blue, and it will be completely impervious to the watercolour. Now the colour difference between one and the other I've got here is subtle, so it's not going to appear too bright. But if you wanted to, you could use a dark blue or a red or a white or something very, very pale, and then you would get a lot more colour contrast. You can also, if you want to, go on top with something darker. So let's go in with some phthalo, and then you'll get a little bit more contrast happening there. Next up, I'm going to show you a way of getting a beautiful, simple highlight on your leaf. Now this can be used for any leaf, and I do use it for smaller leaves as well as for big leaves, but it really comes into its own when you have those long sweeping leaves, a bit like tulip leaves, shall we say. So next I'm using spring green again, and I've mixed a bit of ultramarine into it. So ultramarine's got a touch of red in, and what that means is that not only will it cool your greens down, but also it'll slightly more make them a little bit more muted, so you don't have the brightness if you're looking for a more muted green. And I'm going to apply this paint quickly. I've got a longer leaf here like you might find on a plant like an iris or a tulip, and we're going to apply that very quickly with this nice big brush. So spreading the paint evenly. What I'm going to do then is rinse and semi-dry my brush, and then straight away I'm going to sweep in, and I can lift out a really nice highlight. This is a great technique as well for stems. When you've got plants with wide stems like tulips, you can do this along the center of the stem and get a real lovely three-dimensional look to your leaf. I've got a technique now which relates to our first technique of using two wet colours together, but we're going to adjust the water levels in order to make one colour bleed out and get a feathery edge into the next colour. It's a great technique for using with autumn leaves. For this next leaf we're going for another autumn look. So I've got some more of the spring green and yellow ochre that I used for the leaf with the hole in, but I've added a whole lot more water to it because I want to get quite a pale leaf. And I've also got this Jackman's Sunset Orange Shimmer, which is one of their shimmer colours that's actually got some sparkle in. And I'm going to apply this. We're going to do a wet into wet technique, but we're going to rely on uneven water levels. What this means is that paint that is wetter will spread to areas that are only damp. So I'm applying this first layer here, not being so speedy this time because I actually want this first layer to become sort of semi-dry. So this technique won't work if the paint is dry, but it also won't work if it's just as wet as the paint that's going onto it. So what I need to do now, while that's semi-drying, is I need to get a nice amount of wet paint here. So I'm looking this time for the paint to be drippy and wet, and what this will do is it means that when I apply it to the paint that's only damp, it will bleed outwards. So that's starting to dry now, so let's take this into the middle. And what should happen now is this paint should bleed outwards. So can you see that happening? And we can control it. We can make it go further by taking the paintbrush in further. Bear in mind that I have the board tipped here, so it's not quite as easy to control as it will be for you if you've got your board flat. And then why not, just for fun, let's get our watercolour pencil, take a bit of a darker line along the middle just to get a subtle impression of that centre line there. Now if you try this technique and you find that the paint's bleeding too far or too fast, all you have to do is remove the unevenness in the water levels. So in other words, take your paintbrush that's been dried a little bit and lift out a bit. Again, if I want it to bleed further than that, if I think that's not far enough out, I'll just get a little more of this paint here. Again, it must be wet, and I'll just drip this a bit further out. You need to be patient with this technique as well. It can take some minutes before it bleeds as far as it's going to bleed. And you could, if you wanted to, if you didn't have time, if you put that underneath layer of colour on and it was already dry, what you could do is simply wet the surface with water and let that go semi-dry and then drop paint on top of that. So it's something that you can do afterwards if you've already got a dry colour as well. You just need to put a layer of water on top, let that become semi-dry, and then drip wet paint on top of that. Have you ever had difficulty when you're painting in getting the underneath of the leaf to look different to the top of the leaf? In other words, if you've got leaves that are facing in different directions, or one leaf perhaps that part of it is curled underneath, do you have trouble making the underneath look different to the top of the leaf, and so you're losing that three-dimensional effect? I'm going to show you how to solve that problem. So for this next one, you're getting a bit of a sneak preview because this is fresh green and this is, as you can see, handwritten. It's a sample. It's not been issued yet. I have been working with Jackman's to produce a set of flower painting colours in which there will be 3 greens. And this colour here, the base of this one here, fresh green, I've added a bit of lemon up the top so the colour is true down the base here. This is one of the colours that I am working on and formulating with Jackman's at the moment. So super excited about that. If you're interested in those colours, as I said, they haven't been issued yet, but if you hop over and join my Facebook group, which has the same name as this YouTube channel, you'll be able to find out when those are ready. Now, I want to give the idea of the reverse of the leaf here. Now, there are several ways of doing this. I nearly always find that the reverse of a leaf it's not always lighter, it's usually lighter, sometimes it can be darker, but it's generally less saturated and bluer. So a good thing to do if you have lots of these leaves all in one painting is to fix on a colour for the back of the leaves and paint those all in one go. And you want it to be significantly different to the front of the leaves. So this is what I was saying at the beginning about simplifying, not having 20 different colours on the reverse of your leaves, because then if you have one that's not been drawn quite as well, people will still know that that's the reverse of the leaf because they can see that colour on the reverse of all the other leaves, if that makes sense. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take the fresh green and I'm going to add a little bit of ultramarine to it in my palette and just mix a bit more water in it. So it's going to be bluer and it's going to be cooler and it's going to be less strongly saturated. So the leaf itself is dry because I've got an edge here. The leaf has turned over, so I don't want one running into the other, which means that the leaf has to be dry before I paint this bit. I'm going to go in here and just get this reverse leaf colour. It's a little dark, so rather than worry about remixing it, I'm just going to add a bit more water to my brush as I paint. Remember that watercolours dry a little bit lighter, which if you've painted acrylics is the opposite. So acrylics dry a little bit darker and watercolours dry a little bit lighter. If you want to be especially clever, you can also go in with a little bit of stronger paint or even just a little bit of blue along that edge there, because then we can get the idea that there's a little bit of shadow there where your leaf is turning over. And in that way you can get the reverse of your leaves looking still like part of the leaf. I would always advise you to mix the reverse colour from at least one of the colours that you use in your leaf, preferably all of the colours, and in that way everything hangs together nicely. I have for you now a technique that will help to push some of the leaves in your painting towards the back. So what do I mean? If you have a vase where you have lots of flowers and lots of leaves that are all the same, or perhaps you have a shrub where you have lots of leaves that are all the same, there can be an effect in a painting where they all appear to be sitting on the surface of the paper. You don't get that full idea of 3 dimensions to your painting. So the technique I'm going to show you now will help to push some of your leaves further back. It's a technique that I learned after I was taught to paint by a botanical artist, and I've also observed other botanical artists using this technique as well. I've nicknamed it ghost leaves. So for the ghost leaf technique, I want to keep the leaves that I want pushed back bluer, cooler, less saturated, but I also want them to be much, much simpler. So as you can see in this front one here, I've got a hint of sort of two tones. I've got a hint of three dimensions to it. The ones that I want to sink back, I want to keep them completely flat. So again, I'm starting with the colours I've used there, which was the spring green and the yellow ochre, but I've mixed some phthalo blue in and I've added a lot more water. I'm actually going to change to a smaller brush because I want to paint these quite precisely. And I'm going to paint these leaves behind. So this is the same plant, the same type of leaf, but I'm just getting an idea that the leaves in the background are really much bluer and we can see less detail on them. And if I can see less detail on something, and if it's bluer and cooler and softer, then automatically in my brain it's going to be pushed further away from me, because we know that colours that recede are cooler and softer, and that when we're looking at something, if we can see more detail, it's obviously closer to us. And if we can see less detail on a leaf that's the same leaf from the same plant, but we can see less detail on it, and we've got those other things combined, it's cooler and softer and more muted and less saturated, then automatically in our brains it's going to be pushed further back. So we can start getting those other leaves that are behind in as ghost leaves. Now this is so effective if you're drawing a plant, a botanical plant, you've got loads and loads of leaves, then you can just pop more in behind. And that's another factor that tells us that they're behind as well, because some of them will be going physically travelling behind the leaves in front. This is why you can put them in second as well, because that way you know that all of those bright fresh leaves are in the front and the others are sitting behind. So there's our ghost leaves. I'll try and put a picture up as well where I've used this technique. It really is so effective and so simple to do. Do let me know in the comments which one of these techniques was your favourite. Perhaps you have your own tips for leaf painting that you can share with us too. There will be lots more technique videos coming up on this YouTube channel, so please don't forget to subscribe. If you find that you enjoy painting leaves but you really have trouble mixing greens, then you certainly aren't alone. It's a big problem for people, especially beginners in watercolour painting. I made a video all about it. In fact, I've given you 10 recipes that you can follow to mix beautiful greens. You can watch that video right now.